let's do it then. Talk to me about Anne Conway.
Where do I start? I think what was so interesting for me was discovering Anne Conway and then kind of discovering that no other Quaker I had ever met had ever heard of her, which was so nice to draw attention to someone who was so, like, she was on the periphery of that first story with Fox, Berkeley, all of the big figures, and yet she's not right there at the centre. You know, she's not there at Swarthmore. She's actually in her own stately home, which makes it, you know, a bit like a. I wonder whether there's an alternative history where Ragley Hall could have been the second, could have been the second site or something of Quakerism. But there's a really interesting sense in which she's sort of there. The other thing is, one of the things about Anne Conway, so she, just to give you a bit of background for the listeners, so she was a 17th century aristocrat. Her father was, for a time anyway, Speaker of the House of Commons during a very turbulent period just before the Protectorate. Her life in many ways is quite sad because she lived with a neurological condition, which meant she was in a lot of pain and illness. A lot of the time, she lost a child very early on in her marriage. One of the things, though, that kind of consoles her through all this kind of illness and death and trouble is letter writing. So she spends a lot of her time writing letters to people. And historians are really interested in her because she's the first coherent example in English of a sort of female philosopher that we have identified in print. Doubtless women wrote many things before then, but it was either fragmentary or it wasn't attributed. Where with Anne Conway, we have somebody who is doing philosophy as a woman, despite the fact that women were barred from higher seats of learning in the period. And she befriends a philosopher called Henry More. And Henry More was part of a circle of people called the Cambridge Platonists, who were basically a load of country gents who liked to read classical philosophy and try to apply it to their own Christian faith. And she was arguably the first person to do a kind of philosophy correspondence course. So she wasn't able to attend university, but she wrote these vociferous letters back and forth to Henry More. And as a result, she learnt about, you know, philosophy, alchemy, Jewish mysticism. So she was very interested in the Kabbalah and the meaning of numbers and the meaning of Hebrew letters. And she was just fascinated by, you know, all things arcane. And she's, for that reason, you know, should be studied on her own. But what makes her even more interesting is she became a Quaker, you know, and her household at Ragley Hall was full of Quaker serving staff. So like a group of her serving women are Quakers. And her husband, absolutely, he's a very, very, again, very aristocratic gent, can't stand this because he says they're weird. They just wander into a room and they don't say anything, and then they wander out looking sulky. And this is driving her husband to distraction. And we've got these letters from her husband saying, "Oh, horrible! They're all just always around my wife, and they're just really strange." And it's kind of interesting, I think, because it gives you an insight about how you keep a marriage together, you know, in a time of quite radical religious differences. And the way that, Viscount Conway manages to keep his marriage together is try to ignore his wife and realise that although she's deeply strange and he doesn't really know what to do, he sort of just leaves it in a box and sort of says, well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? But I'll just leave that alone. So, you know, there are lots of strategies to get through a difficult marriage, and that was obviously theirs.
Whatever works, you know. I'd never heard of it. Well, I'd heard of it only because I follow you on Twitter, and sometimes you tweet some lovely tweets about from Anne Conway. But that was my only real introduction. So I was interested. How are we going to go from Cambridge Platonism to an understanding of Quaker narrative? Now, obviously, it makes sense because Anne Conway became a Quaker. But how does this very highbrow sort of philosophy I mean, this is the bit where
Mm.
like my non-academic mind was really sort of put to the test here, trying to like, okay, I'm trusting you, Ben, but what's the kernel of this? Where does this high, well, it might not
Yeah.
be high philosophy. Where does this philosophy fit with Quakerism
Mm.
and your idea of a Quaker narrative?
I think she draws out what is ultimately, at least for me, most important about the Quaker vision of Christianity. So I'd make it as big and as broad as that. So she
Okay.
emphasizes the ultimate love of God for everyone and everything. And she does that by blending like a fusion of sort of Platonic philosophy and Quaker Christianity and her own experience. And she comes to this beautiful cosmic image. So we came back, didn't we, to the idea of like why do we do the stuff that we do? What's the point of being a Quaker? And I think she gives us a vision, a map for why we do what we do. And I think the map that we have from Conway is the idea of universal love, universal salvation, and universal restoration of the universe, which is massive and kind of scary. And you think, well, how do I apply that in my own life? But in the book, I try to show that what Conway is giving us is the idea of love in action, right? So the idea is that we this stuff about angels and reincarnation, which perhaps can go into a bit later, because she does believe in the transformation or transmigration of the soul, which is a very interesting belief for a Quaker in the 17th century, I would say. But she argues that everyone is on a journey towards God, and everyone will find God in the end, because goodness is always attracted to goodness, and goodness will eventually triumph. But I think her important point for us as Quakers today is the idea of slow transformation. So we don't start off being kind of perfect people. We don't start off being cosmically attuned to
Hmm.
the divine plan. We don't always know what we're doing. But Conway's hope, which I think is fundamentally a Quaker hope, is that everything will be drawn back um, to God in the end. And I think what I found so wonderful about Conway's vision is it was very sort of Romans 8 in the sense that it sort of encompassed the whole of creation in this restoration, right? So instead of just saying,
Mm.
it's a very human based story, and who cares about non human animals, and all this kind of stuff, which is very perennial through the Christian tradition to kind of elevate the human experience while ignoring, the ecosystems and the other beings on which our lives depend. And Conway completely destroys that separation. And she says that all beings are on this transformative journey towards God. And that we as Quakers are on a journey with these other beings to be restored and to be reaffirmed and to be loved. And I thought to myself, well, that's a way of reading the Quaker story that other Quakers should know about, because it inspires me. It makes me hopeful. It gives me energy to go and do things. It makes me feel like going to meeting for worship is more than just having some contemplation for an hour. It plugs me into something deeper and larger than that rather thin Quakerism that I described earlier.
Like the first time I read it, I was like, I need to read that again because because it's completely new territory for me. But I think she's really interesting. I think this idea of eventual salvation, I like. Um, I think it's interesting that her logic kind of goes the way that she kind of goes on that is that there isn't an ultimate evil. Well, you correct me if I'm wrong. There isn't an ultimate evil, so things can become evil, but or rather, they can only become. You can only get so evil before you start becoming good again,
Mm.
and so therefore, even though
Yes.
we drift, we will eventually come together. And I think that's a very hopeful idea, especially in the idea of ultimate evil. That well, actually, there isn't any
Mm.
ultimate evil. There's only ultimate good, and I suppose you could believe that because if you believe that God is created the world and is everything, then therefore there is only good. So bad will only ever lead back to good. Um, but it
Yes.
might take time. And so then I can understand why this maybe transmigration of souls business might come into it. And it got me thinking with my Tolkien hat on. I'm not sure. It's sort of the opposite of Galadriel's long war. That it's that she said that that they've been fighting this long war against evil, and or the long defeat, isn't it? That's what she calls it. She's that she says that like eventually we will lose, um, and all we can do is die, diminish, and go to the west. Whereas hers is kind of flipping that on its head, and that's saying actually its eventual victory. We will get there. We can only be so bad before transformation comes in, and that can take place through really small acts of kindness, and that can be, although that might be just a really small thing, the ripple effect throughout eternity is exponential.
Absolutely, all of that. Yeah, all of that, and that's why I think she's so brilliant, because
Yes.
it basically means that you can make these ripples in eternity. So you don't have to be great or grand or go on every protest march and do everything right. No goodness is ever wasted in Conway.
That's lovely, because I think there is a great that Quakers want to fix everything, and they want to be on every protest march, and they feel bad when they're not on one, or I can go on a strike and I felt bad, and that's something that a Quaker should do. But it's not about fixing everything. Even if we fix nothing in our lifetime, it's how that magnifies and multiplies throughout this song of eternity that the divine's been spreading out throughout throughout history. I was wondering with this whole transmigration, well, with her whole sort of Christian animism, which kind of goes on in her, which is kind of maybe the sign of the more out there side of even Quaker theology. Does that fit in with your background in Druidism and all that sort of stuff? Does that speak to you
Yeah, it
particularly because of
does, I
your
think.
background there?
Yeah, it does, I think. So that's one of the really interesting things about my Christian Quakerism, that it has very wild, very green edges to it. And that aspect of my experience as a Quaker has never quite gone away. So even when, I'm in my most sort of quote unquote normal phase, where I'm sort of with other very normal looking Protestants, I sort of think there's going to be a moment, isn't there, where I just say something that makes them all go, that's a bit odd. So
Pretty
discovering
much.
Conway was a bit like coming home, actually, because the more way out dimensions of her reflections on cosmos and life and nature are all kind of things that I've always sensed very intuitively, but never really seen them expressed on paper, particularly from someone who's obviously within the Christian story. So there's
Mm,
a wonderful quotation where she takes the image of Jesus says that God is the God of the living, not of the dead, and could actually could raise stones up into people. And Conway does a very cheeky thing where she sort of makes that literal. So she sort of says, well,
mm,
in the great cosmic alteration of eternity, eventually stones will become other beings because they're slowly progressing towards God. And you're sort of like, oh yeah, well, I suppose in the ultimate sense, we're all made of star matter, aren't we? And we're all
mm,
made of mineral matter, and we're also so. She's got a real sense of the unity of all creation, which guides her theological enterprise. But it also, it has huge ecological implications. So if Quakers are looking for a reason why to go on the Just Stop Oil protest, other than I feel bad, I want to do something about climate change, but if they
mm.
want to fit it into the broader fabric of being Quaker, then Conway is a very good portal, I think, into a deeper understanding of why we say the things we do and why we care about the things that we care about. We've talked about just in passing our kind of joint love of Tolkien, and I think Tolkien has the same longing that's woven
Mm.
into his work, right? I think he wants to find the beauty and depth of nature and locality by looking at the meaning of words. That's the way he finds the deep structure of things by trying to reconstruct the myths and symbols of bygone ages. And so his enterprise is to make us love our locality again. Like if we knew the old names for a local lane, for example, we might be drawn into the lives of previous people that had walked that same lane. Or if we knew about our natural environment a bit more, if we knew about a tree or a particular shrub, we would see things in a different way. And I think Conway is part of that attempt in the book to suggest a way in which we might find deep meaning. You know, when we talk about the glory of creation, it sounds so trite and sometimes quite empty, because you just say it reflectively. Oh, you know, it's great, isn't it, that everything's been made by the divine. Move on. But if you actually sit and think about that for a second, the idea that, you know, everything is loved, everything was meant to be. That is both a wonderful belief and a scary belief. Like the posture is mad. If you just say to a random person in the street, you know, you're meant to be here. You know that this is meant. What this is. It's not perfect. There's stuff wrong with it, but there's a deep reason that this is this. It's that is a very interesting place to come from, isn't it?
Well, thank you very much for watching that short clip. I hope you found it interesting. If you'd like, please do click on the link to watch the full interview. And if you haven't already, please do consider liking and subscribing to find out more about Quakerism in Britain today. Thanks very much.